Late 18th century France was truly a remarkable sight. The nation had been torn apart for years by a fierce and bloody civil war, with everyone fighting against everyone. It was a true picture of chaos. Despite the internal conflicts, however, the country managed to conduct successful military campaigns across Europe, defeating numerous enemies with frightening efficiency. Yet, the people found no joy in these victories. Despite the end of the revolution and the establishment of the Republic, the new government, represented by the Directory, displayed dictatorial tendencies and was largely ineffective in domestic affairs. Amidst this widespread chaos, a new hero emerged, determined to change the fate of the country. He gathered loyal supporters, secured the army's backing, and on November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire by the revolutionary calendar, staged a coup, seizing power. Officially, one regime had replaced another, but in reality, a dictatorship began. Thus, a new ruler appeared, Napoleon Bonaparte, whose rise overshadowed the events of the French Revolution. Though it was difficult to make a name for oneself amidst such grand events, Napoleon's name became a symbol of the era. To understand how this became possible, we must go back about a decade. Many have heard of Napoleon's origins, but a reminder wouldn't hurt. In 1768, the island of Corsica, which belonged to Genoa, came under French control when the Republic handed it over to settle a debt. Shortly after, uprisings began on the island, which France quelled by force. It was in this tense atmosphere in 1769 that Napoleon was born. His family was noble but poor, allowing him to study at a military school in Paris. However, his school years were challenging. His Italian heritage, accent, and the ridicule from his peers hardened his character. When the revolution began, young Napoleon immediately supported its ideals and even joined the Jacobins. Although Napoleon's role in the revolution was minor, one incident made him famous. In October 1795, he suppressed a royalist uprising, which earned him recognition and the rank of general. Just 6 months later, he was sent to the Italian front to fight against the First Coalition, where he was destined to make a name for himself. The War of the First Coalition began in 1792, when monarchical Europe rose against revolutionary France following the king's execution. Despite the chaos, the French not only held their ground, but also went on the offensive. France's success was due to talented generals and the introduction of mass conscription, which gave the nation a massive advantage even before Napoleon arrived. Yet it was Napoleon who achieved something extraordinary when he arrived on the Italian front. In a short time, he secured a series of brilliant victories, employed innovative tactics, and earned the respect of his soldiers. As a man of humble origins, Bonaparte connected with the common infantrymen. He fought alongside them and never shied away from hard work. One of the most famous stories involves Napoleon grabbing a flag and leading his troops in an assault at the Battle of Arcole. Such actions became legendary and won him widespread admiration. Beyond his military victories, Napoleon demonstrated a talent for political maneuvering. He established puppet sister republics on conquered lands like the Venetian, Ligurian, and Roman republics, and personally negotiated treaties with cities. Napoleon distributed looted wealth, deciding what would be sent to Paris and what would remain with the army. He was a shameless master of self-promotion, commissioning articles and portraits to solidify his triumphs. As a result, by 1797, he returned to Paris as a hero and a favorite of the people. Despite the Directory's displeasure at being unable to curb his growing influence, Napoleon Bonaparte was indeed an exceptional military leader, securing numerous brilliant victories. Yet, fortune did not always favor him. After his triumphs on the Italian front, the Directory quickly found a way to rid themselves of a dangerous rival who had won the people's affection. France had long been frustrated by Britain's growing influence in India, but couldn't send a fleet directly due to naval weakness. At that moment, an old Roman idea resurfaced, constructing the Suez Canal in Egypt. In 1798, Napoleon was sent to Egypt to seize the territory and prepare for the possible construction of the canal. The mission seemed secondary but was incredibly complex and potentially very rewarding. If Napoleon succeeded, it would be great. If he perished, the French authorities would not be overly concerned. Napoleon himself likely understood that he was being effectively exiled, but as a true strategist, he embraced the challenge with optimism. Since his military school days, Napoleon had been fascinated by history, and Egypt, described by Herodotus, appeared to him as a land of immense opportunity. He decided to turn the expedition into a scientific adventure, assembling a group of scholars, engineers, and architects from across Europe. Preparations were carried out under strict secrecy to prevent leaks to British spies. Many of the scientists learned the true purpose of the mission only once aboard the ships, but Napoleon assured them that he would strive to ensure the expedition's scientific success. Historians note that Bonaparte indeed kept his promise. He even delayed the army at certain locations to allow archaeologists to complete their excavations. The French scholars made many significant discoveries, earning Napoleon considerable respect in the scientific community. In Egypt, Napoleon quickly took control, established a new administration, and even founded a museum in Alexandria. However, his true goals, constructing the canal and solidifying influence in the region, proved to be extraordinarily difficult. Initial victories over Ottoman forces came swiftly, but the local population did not welcome French rule. Anti-French uprisings erupted throughout Egypt, the most brutal being the Cairo Revolt, which Napoleon suppressed using artillery fire. Then, disaster struck again. A plague epidemic ravaged the French ranks and was later brought back to Europe. The situation worsened when the British fleet, led by Admiral Nelson, destroyed the French ships at the Battle of the Nile, cutting off sea access. The French forces were trapped. The British controlled the seas, while the Egyptian populace rebelled on land. Seeking a way out, Napoleon launched a campaign into Syria, hoping to seize key ports and retrace the path of Alexander the Great. However, the siege of Acre, where Allied British and Ottoman forces put up fierce resistance, ended in failure. The French army had to retreat to Egypt, devastating the land along the way. Burdened by hardships and losses, the campaign became a clear debacle. Sensing the political landscape, Napoleon realized it was time to return to Europe, leaving behind the remnants of his army. The situation in Europe once again reached a breaking point. The Second Coalition against France was formed, comprising the Holy Roman Empire, Naples, the Ottoman Empire, Britain, Russia, and Sweden. These nations aimed to either reclaim lost territories or restore the monarchy in France. Britain, traditionally hostile toward the French, provided significant financial support to its allies. Meanwhile, Spain, harboring animosity toward Britain, sided with France. At the same time, the Directory, weakened by Napoleon's absence and unpopular decisions like the annulment of elections, was losing control. France was sinking into crisis, and public discontent was growing. Upon learning of the dire state of affairs, Napoleon sensed that his moment had arrived. Without hesitation, he left a garrison in Egypt and hurried back to France. His return marked the famous coup of 18 Brumaire. This coup abolished the Directory and established the consulate, led by 3 consuls. By 1800, Napoleon had become the first consul, consolidating power entirely in his hands. This event is often seen as the end of the French Revolution, but our focus now shifts to the Napoleonic Wars. Almost immediately after establishing the consulate, Napoleon turned his attention to the Italian front, where Russian and Austrian forces were entrenched. He deceived his enemies with a bold and unexpected maneuver. No one thought Bonaparte would dare to swiftly cross the Alps, but he did. The element of surprise worked brilliantly, catching his opponents unprepared. Napoleon, of course, seized the opportunity to immortalize this feat. In his famous painting, he aligned himself with great conquerors like Hannibal and Charlemagne. Following a series of victories, Russia and Austria withdrew from the coalition, recognizing France's conquests and agreeing to pay reparations. Most of the Allies capitulated, leaving Britain to stand alone, continuing the war against France. After his decisive victory in the War of the Second Coalition, Napoleon Bonaparte shifted focus to internal reforms, demonstrating that his talent as a military commander could indeed be matched by effective governance. The reforms Napoleon enacted laid a crucial foundation for future developments and conflicts. First, he skillfully allocated funds from reparations and the sale of the Louisiana Territory. These revenues funded essential initiatives, including the establishment of the Bank of France, extensive urban improvements in Paris, educational system reforms, and the restoration of ties with the Catholic Church. However, what stood out most was the militarization of the economy. Approximately 80% of the nation's resources were directed toward military purposes. Soldiers were paid well, and the army was equipped with the latest weaponry, making France a formidable force in Europe. Additionally, Napoleon collaborated with Spain to build a stronger navy, preparing for future confrontations with Britain. Particularly alarming to neighboring powers was Napoleon's shift from his earlier anti-monarchist views. From first consul, he transformed himself into an emperor, crowning himself in 1804 using the crown of Charlemagne, a potent symbol of a united Europe and the grandeur of the Holy Roman Empire. This act was a clear declaration of ambition for European domination and a challenge to monarchic Europe. Before them no longer stood a Corsican general, but a self-declared emperor, founding a new dynasty. Napoleon didn't stop at symbolism. He actively worked to eliminate members of the Bourbon dynasty, cultivate a personality cult, and establish puppet monarchies in former republics, where his influence was already strong. The Italian republics, for instance, were consolidated into the Kingdom of Italy, with Napoleon himself as king. A similar process occurred in the Netherlands. This appeared as a sweeping monarchical takeover across Europe, and it was an audacity that the old European powers could no longer tolerate. With the formation of the Third Coalition in 1805, familiar adversaries, Britain, Austria, Russia, and other allies, once again united against France. Austria sought to reclaim its lost territories, while Britain actively financed the new coalition. Napoleon anticipated the coming conflict and prepared for it. He concentrated his forces, including the Franco-Spanish fleet, in the English Channel, threatening an invasion of Britain. However, before he could make his move, Austria lost patience and launched an offensive against France. This premature action ultimately averted a potential siege of London, which Napoleon had long envisioned. Shifting the war to Central Europe, Napoleon once again employed his renowned strategy of mobility. He divided his Grande Armée into independent corps, each commanded by experienced generals like Joachim Murat and Jean Lannes. This structure allowed the army to move swiftly and respond efficiently to threats, utilizing a network of roads originally constructed by the Romans. This approach gave the French a significant strategic advantage. The war's climax came at the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. where Napoleon faced the armies of Russian Emperor Alexander I and Austrian Emperor Francis II. Napoleon secured a decisive victory, solidifying his dominance and strengthening France's position in Europe. The defeated nations were forced to recognize his conquests and support the independence of his puppet states. However, on the seas, the situation was different. The Franco-Spanish fleet suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of British Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson's victory was so impactful that, even in death, he became a national hero in Britain, which was firmly established as the ruler of the seas. Realizing that he could not defeat Britain at sea, Napoleon resorted to economic warfare, instituting the continental system to strangle British trade. Meanwhile, Napoleon continued to reshape Europe. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, ending 1,000 years of history, and created new political entities, including Austria and numerous German principalities. He also formed the Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German states allied with him. This move alarmed Prussia and neighboring powers, and under pressure from Britain, Sweden, and Russia, Prussia and Saxony joined the Fourth Coalition. The War of the Fourth Coalition began in 1806, continuing the cycle of conflicts. Napoleon once more relied on the mobility of his army and claimed victories, though he faced significant challenges. The Battle of Eylau in February 1807 was particularly brutal and inconclusive, foreshadowing the costly battles to come, such as Borodino. In June 1807, after defeating the Russians at the Battle of Friedland, Napoleon and Alexander met for negotiations in Tilsit. The resulting Treaty of Tilsit offered France a chance to align more closely with Russia. Napoleon did not demand territory or reparations from Russia, but insisted that Alexander recognize his conquests and join the continental system against Britain. Alexander reluctantly agreed, creating a temporary appearance of alliance between France and Russia, though tensions between the two powers simmered beneath the surface. The continental system, which Napoleon imposed on Europe, aimed to isolate Britain economically by banning trade with the island nation. It encompassed nearly all of Europe, with exceptions such as Sweden and Portugal. Russia helped resolve the issue with Sweden, but Napoleon took a more direct approach with Portugal, violating all diplomatic norms by invading through Spain. The Portuguese king fled to Brazil, but the situation in Spain took an unexpected and disastrous turn for the French. A palace coup in Spain brought a new, unfriendly dynasty to power. To secure his influence, Napoleon placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne, but this decision triggered widespread outrage. The Spanish people were deeply resentful of French interference, the abolition of the Inquisition, the ban on bullfighting, and the loss of noble privileges. This resistance ignited a widespread insurgency that evolved into a brutal and protracted guerrilla war. Britain, seizing the opportunity, provided extensive support to the Spanish resistance, leading to a drawn-out and exhausting conflict for France. In 1809, Britain once again supported Austria, which led to the formation of the Fifth Coalition. Inspired by military reforms modeled on the French, Austria launched a new offensive. The war saw Napoleon suffer his first significant defeat at the Battle of Aspern-Essling. Despite this setback, Austria could not capitalize on its victory, and within half a year it signed a peace treaty, ceding large territories to France and reluctantly joining the continental system. Napoleon continued to expand his influence, placing relatives and loyal supporters on thrones across Europe. However, tensions with Russia, which formerly remained an ally of France, grew as Russia persistently violated the terms of the continental system. When Napoleon issued an ultimatum to stop these breaches, Russian Emperor Alexander I responded with unexpected demands, including control over Finland and Constantinople. Outraged, Napoleon began preparations for an invasion of Russia. The French invasion of Russia in 1812 marked a pivotal moment in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon anticipated a swift and decisive campaign, but Russia presented an entirely different challenge. The French army, accustomed to efficient networks of roads and foraging from captured territories, found itself struggling in a land of vast distances and scarce resources. Russia was a poor country, and the local population could not sustain the invading forces. Napoleon's Grande Armée was a multinational force, with only a third of its troops being French. The sweltering heat of the summer of 1812 and the grueling march through endless wilderness led to mass desertions and a severe drop in morale. Napoleon was unable to force the Russians into a decisive engagement until the Battle of Borodino, a costly and brutal clash that allowed him to occupy Moscow. However, the city had been devastated by fires, and the Russians refused to negotiate. With supplies running out and facing the onset of an early and harsh winter, the French were forced into a disastrous retreat across a ravaged landscape. The losses were catastrophic. Of the 600,000 troops who had set out, barely 100,000 returned. The Russian campaign had become a death trap for Napoleon, dramatically weakening his army and leaving his empire vulnerable in Europe. After the disaster in Russia, Napoleon faced major difficulties back home. Unrest and an attempted coup were quickly suppressed, but all of Europe had already heard of the Russian debacle, and preparations for a new war were underway. The Sixth Coalition formed rapidly, largely due to the efforts and support of Russia, which actively encouraged other nations to unite against Napoleon. In the end, all of Europe, including former allies, once again came together to oppose France. Napoleon's situation was critical. He lacked manpower and resources, and he had to withdraw troops from Spain. His army found itself squeezed between multiple fronts. Whenever Napoleon tried to defend one, another front was left vulnerable. The grim outcome was that the French politician Talleyrand betrayed the emperor and handed Paris over to the enemy. This war became the first one Napoleon completely lost. He was exiled to the island of Elba, where he was given the title of ruler, but remained in relative isolation. However, the story didn't end there. Exile on Elba couldn't contain Napoleon's ambitions, and soon he returned to France, beginning the famous 100 Days. Without much resistance, he made his way to Paris and reclaimed power, as the restored Bourbons fled. Napoleon tried to convince the European monarchies that he was willing to live in peace, but they did not believe him. The Seventh Coalition was formed with incredible speed. The war culminated in the decisive Battle of Waterloo. The strategies that had once brought Napoleon victory no longer worked, as his enemies now knew how to counter him. The combination of superior enemy forces, the exhaustion of his army, the loss of his best generals, and long-standing tensions took a toll on his chances. In the end, he suffered his final defeat. The second exile was far harsher. Napoleon was sent to the island of St. Helena, from which he would never return. There are theories suggesting that his health rapidly deteriorated due to stomach cancer, while other theories propose that he may have been slowly poisoned. Napoleon's impact on world history was immense. He redrew the map of Europe, laying the groundwork for the future unifications of Italy and Germany, and his legal and financial reforms left a lasting mark on the governance systems of many countries. The introduction of the Napoleonic Code and banking reforms had a significant influence on modern civilization. Napoleon's wars also acted as a catalyst for the spread of liberal ideas, nationalism, and democratic movements across Europe, which led to subsequent uprisings and struggles for national independence. Fear of these ideas forced European monarchs to unite, but it was these very concepts that ultimately paved the way for a new era of change. In that sense, could it be argued that Napoleon still achieved a sort of victory? The question remains open.